This brand new Lockheed 1011 Tristar is in a go-around from Miami International Airport due to a technical malfunction. All three pilots are working together to try to solve the issue when they inadvertently activate a subsystem to the autopilot, which starts a chain of events that will lead to an accident that will change the way that pilots all over the world deal with things like teamwork and problem solving. Stay tuned. A huge thank you to Bose Aviation for sponsoring this video. The story of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 took place on the 29th of December 1972. It was a scheduled domestic passenger service from JFK International Airport over towards Miami International Airport. The aircraft that was being flown was a brand new Lockheed 1011 Tristar. It's a beautiful aircraft with 3 engines, 2 on the wings and 1 in the back, and it was quite sophisticated for its time. It had a very good autopilot system. It could do autoland, and the autopilot system and one of its subsystems is actually going to become really important for this story later on. On board the flight this day was 163 passengers, 10 cabin crew members and 3 pilots. In charge of the flight was 55-year-old Captain Robert Loft. He was a very experienced captain with a total time of 29,700 hours, but he'd only flown about 280 on the Tristar because it was very new to the fleet, and the aircraft that they were about to fly on this day had only been in the fleet for about 4 months, since August of 1972. Assisting him was 39-year-old First Officer Albert Stockstill. He had 5,800 hours of total time and 306 hours on the Tristar. And also 51-year-old flight engineer Donald Repo. He was also very experienced with 15,700 hours and 53 hours on the type. The crew went through their pre-flight preparation just as normal. They had a look at the NOTAMs, they had a look at the en route weather and the destination weather, which in Miami was really nice. It was only some scattered clouds around, some light easterly winds and very good visibility. So First Officer Stockdale was designated the pilot flying for the flight, and at time 21:20 Eastern Standard Time they took off towards Miami. During the flight, the pilots used the autopilot, and the autopilot on the Tristar is remarkably similar to the autopilot that we're using on the Boeing 737 that I fly today. It had 2 separate channels, channel A and B. Channel A would give commands to the flight director on the captain's side, and channel B would do the same on the first officer side. And those 2 channels are normally not used together unless you are planning to do an autoland, which is exactly the way that we do it on the Boeing. Now, in order to understand why this accident happened, you need to understand how the autopilot works. So the autopilot on the Tristar could be utilized in 2 different ways. You had a basic mode and a slightly more advanced mode. In the basic mode, the autopilot was used in what we call control wheel steering. So that's basically a servo mode where the pilots can input on the yoke, for example, put a pitch or a roll in, and once they have put whatever pitch and roll they want in, they can release it, and the autopilot will continue to do what the pilots have inputted. Okay, that's control wheel steering. It's very simple, and it's very rarely used, at least not in normal operations. And at the time, at Eastern Airlines, they weren't really supposed to use control wheel steering either. Now, the slightly more advanced mode is what you guys think about when you think about autopilot. It's setting a specific vertical speed, telling the aircraft to climb to a specific altitude, holding a specific heading, and so on. So that's the modes that we tend to normally use. In more modern aircraft, we also have things like VNAV, but that wasn't available on the Tristar at the time. The initial part of the flight was completely uneventful. The crew started briefing and setting up for an ILS approach into runway 09 left in Miami International, and they initiated their descent. During the descent, the pilots used a combination of both autopilot flight and manual flight. We have to remember that this was back in 1972, where the pilots relied much more on manual flight, and they only used the autopilot really to relieve a little bit of workload. There was, back then, just like now, actually a discussion of whether or not pilots should be using the autopilot because they were losing manual flying skills. Obviously, Now we're flying much more using Autopilot, a bigger percentage of the flight than what they did back then. Before we go into the accident sequence in this video, I just want to say a few words on behalf of one of my longest serving sponsors of the channel, which is Bose Aviation. I have been using Bose Aviation headsets for years now, starting off with the A20, going on to the ProFlight Series 1 and then ProFlight Series 2. And the reason I keep using them is because of really good audio quality and high reliability. Did you know, for example, that all Bose Aviation headset has to be TSO approved? TSO stands for Technical Standard Order, and it means they have to go through a quite crazy testing regime, including things like having it frozen down to minus 25 degrees Celsius and then dropped from 2 meters onto a concrete floor and still work. If you are on the hunt for a great aviation headset that you can really trust, well then check out the link in the description below. I've linked to all of the resellers in your specific area, and there's also a link about how the TSO testing is done, which is quite fascinating, so check it out. When the aircraft got stabilized on final approach into runway 09 left, First Officer Stockstill asked for gear down. Captain Loft reached over, selected the gear down, but realized quite quickly that he only got 2 out of the 3 green indicator lights illuminated. The one on the nose wheel was not illuminated. These 3 green indicator lights are really important because they indicate not only that the gear has been extended, but also that it has locked into a safe position so that it will not collapse when you land on the runway. In the 737 that I fly, we have 2 separate indicators. So we have one just next to the gear and then one in the aft overhead panel. And if you get a green light on any of these indicators, it means that the gear is down and locked. So you can have a burned out light bulb, for example, on one of them, but if you get it on the second one, you can continue to land. It's not a problem. On the Lockheed 1011 though, it was a little bit different. So on that aircraft, if one of the lights did not illuminate, then you would have to go out and do a visual check of the landing gear from lenses that were available in certain parts of the aircraft, and obviously that would take a little bit more time. So Captain Loft, he cycled the gear. It meant he took it back up again and then extended it. Hopefully that would solve the problem. Unfortunately it didn't, so the nose landing gear light still stayed extinguished. At time 23:34, Captain Loft calls up air traffic control and he calls tower, this is Eastern 401. It looked like we're gonna have to circle here. We don't have the light for the nose wheel yet. Miami Tower comes back and responds, Eastern 401, that's Roger, climb straight ahead to 2,000 feet and contact approach control on 128.6. And this is then read back by the crew. So the crew has now decided to go around, which is the correct thing to do. They need to make sure that the aircraft is fully safe before they attempt a landing. And from a fuel standpoint, this is not a problem at all. In fact, they took off from JFK with 85,000 pounds on board, and the planned trip fuel was only 42,000 pounds. So they had almost twice as much fuel on board as they would need to. That would never happen today because we are so conscious about the weight that we're carrying. But back in the day, fuel burn, not so much of a deal. And in this case, it means that they have plenty of time to troubleshoot this problem once they've gone around. During the go around, the gear was left in its down position and the flaps were left in 18 degrees. When they reached 2,000 feet, Captain Loft contacted the approach controller and told them that they were having a problem with the nose gear indicator landing light and that they wanted to be kept in the area. Approach control came back and told them that that was acknowledged and that they could turn left onto a northerly heading initially. During the turn, and at time 23:36:04, Captain Loft tells First Officer Stockstill to engage the autopilot, and he does so. That's going to become very important for what's about to happen next. Air traffic control comes back in and tells Eastern 401 to turn left onto heading of 300. The crew reads this back, and in the subsequent 30 seconds there is a discussion between the pilots where First Officer Stockstill is removing the light fitting for the nose gear indicator light. Once it's done so, he's then trying to put it back in again, but it jams in position, and they have a discussion of why this is happening. Now, anyone who has been following this channel for a while will probably pick up that this is where the first real problem with crew resource management is appearing. Because who is actually flying the aircraft? Remember, First Officer Stockstill is the pilot flying, And he is now also dealing with the problem as the captain is talking to him about that same problem. What we have to remember here though is that back in 1972 there is no such thing as crew resource management training. In fact, the accident that is about to happen here is going to be one of the driving reasons for CRM training to be taken up by the entire industry. And things like, for example, dividing the cockpit, making sure that one pilot is concentrating on flying and the other pilot is the one dealing with the problem, is going to become standard. But at this time, that's not the case. At time 23:37, Captain Loft turns back in the cockpit toward flight engineer Repo and tells him that he needs to go down into the electronic bay and look through a lens to see if he can verify that the nose gear actually is in the down and locked position. Now what has potentially happened here is that as Captain Loft turns back, he accidentally pushes the yoke. Remember what we talked about, the difference between control wheel steering of the autopilot and command, which is when you have the normal vertical speed, heading and altitude hold modes? Well, another peculiarity with this is that you can go from the command mode into the control wheel steering mode by actually manually inputting on the yoke. And if you're doing so, the autopilot is actually not disconnected. It's just going into a lower mode of automation, which means that there's no warning in the cockpit when this is happening. So if Captain Loft accidentally pushed the yoke here, the only indication that they would see of the aircraft going from altitude hold at 2,000 feet into control wheel steering when it's now doing whatever input that the pilots had put would only be a slight change in the flight mode annunciation. And obviously, if you monitor the flight instruments, you would also see that the aircraft is starting to deviate from what it's supposed to do. Because from the flight data recorder, there was an indication when the captain turned back and started talking to the flight engineer of the aircraft starting a slight descent. And it descends within the next few seconds about 100 feet before it stops because of a slight pitch up momentum. Air traffic control now comes in and tells Eastern 401 to turn left onto heading of 270 degrees. This is most likely an extended downwind to prepare the aircraft so that they're ready for a left turn in and start another approach in for runway 09 left. The crew reads this back, and following this, both the captain and the first officers continue to discuss the fact that First Officer Stockstill cannot get the light fitting back in for the nose wheel indicator light, and they're clearly very involved in this discussion, both of them. The captain also turns back to remind the flight engineer to once again go back down into the electronics bay under the cockpit to verify the position of the nose wheel. At time 23:38:41, Captain Loft calls air traffic control and tells them that they're still working on the problem with the nose gear indicator light and that they're going to need a little bit more time. Air traffic control also reads this back. Once that call is finished, flight engineer Repo pops his head up into the cockpit and says, "I can't see nothing down there, it's all black." Now at this point, there is actually a fourth person in the cockpit with them. It's a deadheading pilot who's been sitting on the jump seat, and he volunteers to come down and help the flight engineer down inside of the electronics bay to see if they can figure it out, why they can't see anything. In the subsequent investigation after the accident, it was found that in order for the flight engineer to be able to look through that little lens in the electronics bay, two things needed to happen. First, the captain would have had to switch on the nose wheel light, which was situated in his eyebrow panel up to the left. And also, flight engineer Repo, when he got down into the electronics bay, he needed to pull a little knob next to the lens. That removes a lens cover and that enabled him to look out. So if one of these things were not done, remember, this was during nighttime, that might be an explanation to why the flight engineer could not see anything, no matter how hard he was looking through the lens. While the flight engineer is down in the electronics bay trying to look through the lens, you can hear on the cockpit voice recorder a half-a-second C chord chime. This chime is a warning that's indicating that the aircraft has deviated more than 250 feet from the selected altitude on its MCP, but when you listen to the voice recorder, there's no indication that any of the other pilots heard this or at least reacted to it. But how is it possible that pilots didn't hear this, and is there no other indications available in the cockpit that the aircraft is deviating from the altitude? Well, it turns out that that chime is actually played from a speaker that's situated above the flight engineer station. And remember, the flight engineer is down in the electronics bay at this point. Also, there is a light that's supposed to be flashing in the cockpit whenever this happens, but Eastern Airlines at the time have chosen to deactivate that whenever the aircraft is below 2,500 feet. So in this situation, that half a second C-chord chime is the only indication that the aircraft is leaving the cleared altitude, except for, of course, the actual altimeter in itself. As the pilots are concentrating on getting this light fixture back into place, the speed of the aircraft has been gradually increasing. Now, the auto throttle was not engaged at the time, so at some point one of the pilots must have reached over and reduced the thrust slightly, possibly because they saw that the speed was creeping up. The fact that they did that caused a slight pitch down of the aircraft, which increased the vertical speed. At time 23:41:40, the Miami approach controller calls up Eastern Airlines and they said, Eastern 401, how are things coming along out there? The reason the approach controller is calling this is because he looks at his radar screen and he realizes that the aircraft is about to leave his controller area. But he also realizes that the altitude that is shown coming from the aircraft Mode C transponder is only indicating 900 feet. Now, at the time, the approach controller was not worried about the safety of the aircraft, and the reason being that the Mode C transponder altimeter readout quite frequently showed erroneous values. It needed at least 1, 2 or 3 radar swipes before he would take any type of action. Captain Loft responded to this message saying, okay, yeah, would like to turn around and come back in again. Miami approach controller said, okay, in that case, turn left on a heading of 180 degrees. Now you might be asking yourself, if this aircraft is descending down towards the ground and none of the pilots seemingly is monitoring their instruments, isn't there a system like the ground proximity warning system that would be triggered? Well, this is the thing. Back in 1972, it was not mandatory to have ground proximity warning system installed on commercial jetliners. There had been accidents before this accident, so the work was actually ongoing on putting this mandate in place, but it was not yet in place. Seconds after the turn is initiated, First Officer Stockstill says, "We did something to the altitude." And Captain Hall responds, "What?" That's then followed by Stockstill saying, "We're still at 2,000 feet, right?" And Captain Loft saying, "Hey, what's going on here?" That's the last message on the voice recorder. Only 2 seconds after that, at time 23:42:12, the first sounds of impact can be heard on the cockpit voice recorder. The aircraft crashes into the Everglades swamp at a speed of 197 knots and with a bank of 28 degrees as the aircraft is trying to reach the heading of 180 as instructed by the pilots. Because it's in a turn, it impacts with the left wing first, followed by the left engine and the left main landing gear. And the impact is so strong that the aircraft immediately shatters into several smaller pieces. 101 passengers and crew perish in this accident, but miraculously, 75 people actually survives. When the pieces comes to a complete stop, well then the survivors manage to get outside, but here they are faced with the next problem, and that is that the cabin crew at this time is not mandated to have any flashlights with them at their stations. So as the surviving crew gets outside and tries to help and to get the passengers together and away from the wreckage, they find that it's pitch black, they don't have any flashlights, it's very hard for them to organize the work. So as a consequence of this, you'll find now in every commercial aircraft, if you have a look at where the cabin crew is seated, that there's always a flashlight ready. So that if something like this would happen in the hours of darkness, they'll be able to organize the work and help the survivors as good as possible. When air traffic control realizes that they've lost radar contact with Eastern Airlines Flight 401, they immediately push the button indicating that a crash has happened. This sends out a message to the Coast Guard, who start looking for the aircraft, and they find it fairly quickly. At the time when they find it, there's actually been some locals who has been out frog fishing in the swamps during the night who had seen this aircraft coming in at very low altitude. They have managed to reach the crash site before the Coast Guard gets there, and they have been helping survivors to get away from the wreckage. When it comes to the flight crew, both Captain Loft and First Officer Stockstill are killed in the impact, and the flight engineer Donald Repo, he actually survives the impact initially and is brought to hospital, but dies because of his injuries later on. The air accident investigation found that the probable cause of this accident was the failure of the pilot to monitor their flight instruments during the last 4 minutes of the flight. This was caused by all of the pilots being preoccupied with the nose gear indicator light, and no one was actually really flying the aircraft. What this led to, together with some other accidents that happened around this time as well, was that the aviation world started focusing in on the area of crew resource management, CRM. And this actually kick-started the crew resource management training that all pilots are doing up to this day. It is extremely important that pilots, when faced with some kind of malfunction, divide the roles in the cockpit, so that one pilot flying, is focusing on aviate, navigate, communicate, keeping the aircraft safe and flying, and the other pilot focusing on dealing with non-normal checklists and sorting out the malfunction, and that they communicate well between each other. Another thing that was sped up by this accident was, as we mentioned previously, the adaptation of ground proximity warning systems, and the fact that all commercial airliners right now will have a system like that in force. There was also recommendations that cabin crew needed to have access to a flashlight in case of an evacuation, and also some smaller technical instructions for Lockheed to make sure that the viewing lens down in the electronics bay had a little placard next to it that explained how to use it properly, and that potentially they could put the switch for the nose wheel light next to it. During the autopsy of the flight crew, they also found that the captain actually had a rather large brain tumor that was growing. That could potentially have affected his peripheral vision without him even noticing it. But that was fairly quickly ruled out as a cause, because both colleagues that had been flying with him during the weeks before the accident, as well as his family, indicated that he had had no problems whatsoever with vision up until that point. Now, you might have heard that this accident led to some quite persistent ghost stories, and a few years back I did a Halloween special that you can check out up here if you want to hear them. Also, if you want to see a great example of where CRM really works well then check out this video up here. Remember the acronym CLASS, and have an absolutely fantastic day. Bye-bye.